Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for today's Conversations on Revenue Raisers, organized by City and State and the Community Service Society. I'm Zach Williams, staff reporter with City and State, coming to you live from outside the Assembly chambers here in Albany. We got a great lineup of legislators and policy experts to discuss outstanding proposals to raise taxes on the wealthy as the state continues efforts to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and, of course, plug its budget hole. We've set aside a chunk of time towards the end of today's event for the audience to submit questions to them, which you can do in the Q&A channel. Feel free to drop them right in there in that chat channel as they come up, and I'll try to get them in towards the end. But before we get to that, to our panel discussion, we're going to get a crash course in a new report from the Community Service Society called How Tax Reforms Can Address Historic Inequality and Save Our State, which analyzes these outstanding proposals to raise taxes on personal income, accrued wealth, and financial transactions. The details can get a little bit complicated, so we got the two co-authors of the report, Emerita Torres, Vice President for Policy Research and Advocacy, and Debipriya Chatterjee, Senior Policy Analyst for Income Inequality at CSS, and they're going to explain their analysis of these new tax proposals.
Thank you so much, Zach, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. It is my pleasure to open up the discussion with a presentation on our latest report titled How Tax Reforms Can Address Historic Inequality and Save Our State. At the Community Service Society of New York, we track the pulse of working class and low-income New Yorkers and the challenges that they face, from access to healthcare and affordable housing, to employment opportunities and their ability to seek legal assistance and justice. From there, we develop and advocate for policies that improve their livelihoods and opportunities. High on our agenda is advocating for policies and programs that ensure a just and equitable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, because working class New Yorkers, including communities of color, have without a doubt been the hardest hit. So why did we do this report? Today, we know that New York is facing a daunting fiscal crisis because of the pandemic and its related economic fallout. The state is facing a $15 billion budget gap this year and a projected $39 billion gap over the course of the next 4 years. Now, we know that Washington has a critical role to play in supporting New York to help address this gap, but it remains to be seen to what extent Washington will bail out our state. The conditional executive budget, if Washington does not bail out our state entirely, includes cuts of approximately $6.4 billion, largely to education, Medicaid, and local aid programs, which would add more burden to communities of color and low-wage working New Yorkers who have carried the weight of the pandemic on their shoulders. How have working New Yorkers carried this weight? Well, unemployment has skyrocketed as jobs disappeared. We lost more jobs during the height of the pandemic than during the Great Recession of 2009. New York has already lost over 1 million jobs since the pandemic began, with over 500,000 lost in New York City alone. And such job losses have been disproportionately concentrated in low-wage sectors and in communities of color, which has led to the widening of the already pre-existing income and wealth gaps in the state. But the truth is, wealth and income inequality has been on the rise in New York and across the country for decades. Since 1989, the share of all wealth owned by the top 10% of households has increased from 61% to 69%, while the share of wealth owned by the bottom half of households fell by 50%. So this is staggering. It is important to point out as well that the COVID-19 economic downturn is considered the most unequal recession in US history, with the lower end of the economy suffering the most financially. And as New Yorkers continue to suffer these major financial and economic blows, we have seen that large corporations and high earners have, in several cases, profited even during a pandemic. For example, the net worth of the 118 billionaires in New York State increased by 77 billion just from mid-March to mid-July of 2020. We also know that corporate profits reached a historic high of $2 trillion during the pandemic. So what does this all mean? There will be substantial pressure on the government to deliver to low-income and working families who have been the most negatively affected and impacted by the pandemic. So now is not the time for austerity budgets. Secondly, as we've seen, there remains a sizable tax base in New York State by which to increase revenue because of the concentration of wealth and high profits of financial corporations, including those high profits and wealth generated during the pandemic. So our report highlights that personal income, accrued wealth, and financial transactions are areas that the state should strongly consider when thinking about tax reform, as these areas have the potential not only to increase substantial revenue for the state, while addressing stark income and wealth inequality that has grown ever wider since the pandemic began. Our report goes into some of the considerations when taxing, these particular areas, the pros and cons, et cetera. So I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Debipriya Chatterjee, who's going to go through the report in much more detail. Over to you, Debbie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. My name is Debipriya Chatterjee. I'm a senior economist with CSS. And just like Emerita said, with the current background of increasing inequality and the state and the city looking at a fiscal crisis, we wanted to see what were some of the levers we could recommend as policy analysts in addressing the difficulty of the present times. So mostly in the first part of my presentation, I'm going to zoom in on the points that Emerita has touched with provide you some more information. And then we are going to look at the tax reform areas that we have outlined above. So we are looking at combined budget deficit of about 15 billion for the next two state fiscal years. And that grows up to 39 billion in the outer years. So one of the immediate reasons, or one of the immediate motivations for looking at these kinds of tax reforms is naturally so that we can avoid an austerity budget, because to meet a $15 billion budget gap would naturally imply otherwise is a deep cuts into essential services, some of which are lifeline for low income and vulnerable New Yorkers. The cuts that have been proposed in the executive budget total to around 6.4 billion. And these are serious cuts to education, both higher education, public health, in the wake of a pandemic. And we are still battling the worst public health crisis of this century, probably, and deep cuts to local government. There is, and all of the cuts, the point that we have to remember is that a cut today has consequences that last for generations. So if we are employing austerity budget for education or public education, the long-term effect of that in a reduced quality of human capital or quantity of human capital is going to show up as the state proceeds through the next few years. It's not just numbers on balancing the book. Those are actual disinvestments among the New Yorkers. So taking a step back to remind ourselves what the context is over here, we have the labor market, which kind of is going through a catastrophe right now, starting with the onset of pandemic. The current unemployment rate of 8.1, this is statewide unemployment rate, matches the worst the unemployment rate that the state experienced during the Great Recession. So we are currently at the worst point of what we were during the Great Recession, although it feels like we have improved, because at the peak of pandemic, the unemployment rate was 16%, double that of what we experienced during the Great Recession. And the blue bars, they are the jobs that the state had, annual numbers of jobs across the state. And we have lost over 1 million jobs, 500,000 of them only in New York City. And then here is the more tragic angle to it, that the jobs that have been lost, they are mostly in the low wage income sectors. And a lot of them are not coming back. So this is a graph from the Opportunity Insights, where they are using current data from payroll services and job postings to show that the pandemic and the related recession is essentially over for high wage workers, those who make more than $60,000 annually. But for the middle income workers, it is still there. Their employment is still depressed by 6.1%. And for the low wage workers, the acuteness of the recession is the most. They are still 22% less than what they were in January of the last year, so a year ago, when the pandemic hit the economy. So the entire analysis has to be kept, has to be understood, or has to be, as we work through these arguments and look at these proposals, this is the picture that I want you to keep in mind going forward, that it is the low income workers that are hurting the most. For today's presentation and the report, we have focused on three areas of revenue of reforms for revenue raising: personal income, accrued wealth, and financial transactions. The reason we chose these three areas is because we feel they're sort of interconnected, and also because they are the prime source of driving the hyper inequality that characterizes our state. So personal income for the very high end is mostly coming from the financial sector. A lot of it, because of the preferential tax treatment, does not get taxed fairly, and goes on to add to accrued wealth for such households, and which they go on to invest again into financial assets through the stock market and so on. So these are the three kind of sort of related areas that we have chosen to focus. And I'm going to now walk you through our motivation for the reforms that we are proposing. So within personal income, the first thing we have to look at when we are talking about personal income taxes in New York State and also New York City is the extremely unequal nature of the distribution. So in this table over here, 97.4% of filers who earn below 500,000 have the shared 46% of the income pie. If you think of whole taxable income produced in New York State as a pie, then they are sharing 46% of that, and they are sharing 51% of the tax liability. However, people making over $1 million a year, who are 1.1%, the 1%ers, and they are around 122,000 of them. So 122,000 New Yorkers also sharing this almost the same size of the pie, around 45% of the economic pie, and they have a tax liability of 40%. As we go zoom further into the higher slices of the income earners, we will see the same pattern being repeated over and over again. The 1% of the 1% has a greater income share and has a smaller tax liability as we look up the spectrum. And the other thing I would like to draw your attention to is the composition of the personal income. It varies a lot depending on where in the income distribution you are. If you are most of the regular New Yorkers, they get most of their income in the form of wages, but the high earners get most of their income in the form of capital gains or investment income. And these have, and the reason I am highlighting this is because the tax policies are different. The tax rates that are employed, the effective tax rates are different for the kind of income that it is being applied to. So 79–80% of wage income comes from New Yorkers who earn below $500,000, but 82% of capital gains come from New Yorkers who earn over $500,000. So that would be the 125,000 that I showed you in the previous table, right? So this stark difference in the composition, combined with the highly unequal share of taxable income and tax liability, are the two major points that we have to remember as we look at increasing personal income tax rates. So the senators that we have among over here and have proposed a variety of bills, most of them targeted at raising the top tax marginal income tax rates. What are the ramifications of that? It raises revenue, of course. That's what we want over here. It reduces inequality by making the post-tax distribution fairer, by allowing us to provide more in transfers to those at the lower end who are probably not as fortunate and has not been enriching themselves during the pandemic. And finally, and this point gets obfuscated in most debates, it's that this revenue, when invested in New Yorkers, it's a pro-growth investment. When you take this revenue and invest it in education, it's not a giveaway, it's not a handout. It's something to grow the economic pie. So, and as we saw before, when you grow the economic pie, the top earners who are, who own a large share of the economic pie, they will also get more in returns, right? So this is the classic. There's no equity efficiency trade-off that is happening over here, so long as you invest, and we badly need to invest in infrastructure, in education, in public health, and in affordable transit, affordable housing. And so what this brings us to the critiques. They are going to point out that, you raise taxes on the high earners, they might leave the state. So the migration of high earners. Well, that's a valid point, and there are some studies suggesting that it's happening. But the weight of the evidence, and that we have analyzed, or when we researched, we found it overwhelmingly supports the fact that the migratory millionaire hypothesis is kind of a misperception. It's more of something that you want to believe because it's kind of makes sense, but the empirical evidence does not hold it. It does not hold up. The weight of empirical evidence does not verify it. It's kind of how the debate for minimum wage was until very recently, when you thought that increasing the minimum wage would lead to loss of jobs. But now the whole economics profession has come around to almost accepting that the job effects, the employment loss effects are not much. So this is something similar happening here. The migratory millionaire hypothesis has not been shown to borne out in California in the 3 rounds of tax rate hikes that they did on the millionaires. For New Jersey, when it increased tax rates on half millionaires, like making 500,000 or more. And then the millionaires that they did more recently. Same for New York. The number of high net worth individuals in New York after it passed a surcharge in 2009 after the Great Recession has increased by 10%. So we have richer, wealthier New Yorkers that have flocked to the state over the past decade, even though New York is one of the highest states with a very high tax burden. So that's our take on it, that it's true, but the weight of the empirical evidence does not bear it out. Moving on to the next category, accrued wealth. So accrued wealth, that any proposal about taxing accrued wealth has to be understood in the context of wealth inequality. Wealth inequality, as probably everyone is aware, in this country has been rising over the last 30 years. Compared to 1989 to 2019, the top 10% households, they increase their share of the total wealth, and they also increase the median net worth. So here I have a chart showing the median. This is like the average, the typical person, in the middle of the top 10% of the wealth households. So the y-axis is thousands of dollars. So in 1989, the top 10%, the median wealth was 1.3 billion, and now it is 2.5 billion. And you can see the rest of the graphs. You don't even need to read the labels; they're all flat. So everyone else really did not have that much of an increase in wealth over the past 30 years. Similarly, wealth inequality was stark to begin with, but it worsened over the pandemic. The bottom 50% owns 2% of the share of all wealth, only 2 trillion. But the top 1% have 35 trillion. That's a trillion with a T, which are 30% of all the wealth. And I would just like you to, if you can see it, I don't know how well you can see it on your screen, but like to draw your attention to the little dip over there at the end, after which the wealth accumulation has rebounded and reached an historic high of 35 trillion for the top 1%. When you stratify wealth inequality by race, the picture is even more dismal. Median net worth of white households are close to $200,000, while that for a black households is $24,000. So, and these are not just a matter of stark statistics and visualizations. This is actual. This translates to actual differences in opportunities that communities have. So, wealth provides credit for education, for opening a business, for entrepreneurship, for innovation. You have a great idea, but if you cannot put up collateral for credit, it does not really translate to increasing your wealth or well-being. So that's why we are focused on understanding and ways to combat wealth inequality in the state. And about taxation of wealth, the next thing that we need to remember is just like personal income, the composition of wealth is also very different when you move across the spectrum. So for most regular New Yorkers or for most regular Americans, wealth is in the form of their houses and any other assets like cars or whatever they might own. But for the top 1%, wealth is in the form of financial assets. That is the red kind of slice of the bar over here. And as you see, we are moving from bottom 50 to next 40, next 9, and the top 1%, the size of the red bar continues increasing, meaning that the most of the wealth that they have is in the form of financial assets. So what is the take on taxing wealth, and how is it going to work out? One of the challenges, and I'm here beginning with the critiques here, that is put forward is the constitutionality of taxing wealth in New York State. While the taxing of intangible wealth in New York State is probably not constitutional, what might be constitutional, and here we are just reporting to you the analysis that we have seen and the recommendations that we have from legal experts, but we are not experts, so we are speaking this with a caveat. If you are taxing the increases in the value of the wealth, that's why we are referring to it as accrued wealth, the increase in the value of the wealth, not the wealth stock itself, that probably might be constitutionally illegal in the state. And then with every tax hike, there is of course the migration of the wealthy is a possibility. And again, when we analyze the evidence, we find that is typically not the case. The wealthy do not flee their state of residence as soon as the rate is increased. However, there are certain considerations. We have to keep the rate of tax should not be so high that it affects moderately wealthy people, because that was the case what happened in France when they increased that rate by a lot and everyone was affected. There was a lot of migration to UK and so on. And also we have to be aware of tax evasion that the rich might avail of to hide their wealth, to avoid taxation. However, because most of their tax is in the form of financial assets, it would be easy to administer because you can attach a price to most of the financial assets, even if they are not sold or bought in the market. Moving on to the last bucket area of our reforms, financial transactions. So as most of you probably are aware that even though the real economy has been hurting and their joblessness has been climbing, the stock market seems to be unfazed, right? The stock indices, S&P and DIGA and NASDAQ have been climbing to historic highs. Same thing with the corporate profits. Corporate profits have reached a whooping, insane 2.5 trillion over during this quarter of the past 2 quarters of the pandemic. Say the pattern of increased wealth for corporations holds the same for financial as well as non-financial firms. And so this is the time when we think that imposing financial transaction taxes of the kind that other stock exchanges already have might be feasible and a good idea. So one of the things that for example, we looked at was the stock transfer tax. It is a small tax. It is small in the sense that when the tax as a relative to the share to the price of a share, it's really minuscule. And it also provides a lot of advantage for big trading companies because there's a cap of $350 that you can pay on the tax on any particular day. So if you're trading lots of shares that are priced very high, then the stock transfer tax is minuscule. The state already collects it and rebates it back to the financial firms. And we are looking at the possibility that there might be an elimination of the rebate, either complete or partial, and that might add some additional revenue to the state coffers. So for the stock transfer tax, it would raise revenue, it is easy to administer, and it's a small tax. These are things in its favor. Again, the same question comes up, would that spur firms to migrate? Would that, and here, there are there's another associated question. If it spurs firms to migrate out of the state, would they still be liable for the transactions conducted through the New York Stock Exchange because of economic nexus kind of idea, right? So economic nexus standards say that the transactions that are implemented or executed in New York State would be taxable. So what would be what ramifications there? We feel that they would be falling under the nexus, that the standard would extend to them. But again, we are not corporate law experts, so we would like your feedback and your recommendations on this. One point that is usually pointed out for stock transfer tax, it's highly volatile because it is related to the market, and it's the revenue from that is going to experience big swings. For example, it can range from 5 billion to 13 billion in any given year, depending on how the market performance unrolls. So these are some of the issues related to the taxes. We look forward to your questions and comments during the Q&A session. And I would just like to conclude by reminding everyone the backdrop with which we started. There's a fiscal crisis. There's an urgent need to raise money to avoid austerity. And especially because the austerity in public services would doubly hurt the low-income New Yorkers who have been especially hurting from the pandemic. So it is the group that has been especially hurting is going to be the one who might be asked to make more sacrifices, and they would raise revenue, but also as a collateral, they would address the growing concentration of income and wealth. And with that, I would kick it over to Zach, and I'm stopping and I'm moving on to the screen.
Thank you so much, Emerita and Debipriya. Great overview of the big picture with raising taxes. I strongly urge anyone in our audience to give the new report a read. I read it this morning, and it just has so much great information about all these different proposals and how they work together. But now comes the time to introduce our different panelists, many of whom have their own proposals before the state legislature. Please give a wave to the audience as I introduce each of you before we give a minute each to deliver your elevator pitches on your respective proposals. First up, we're going to have Assemblymember Phil Steck of the Capital Region. We got Senator Robert Jackson of Manhattan, Senator Rachel May of Syracuse, Senator Shelley Mayer of Westchester, Senator Jessica Ramos of Queens, Senator Jabari Brisport of Brooklyn, and rounding things off is Judy Sheridan-Gonzalez, president of the New York State Nurses Association. So let's jump right into this stock transfer tax that Assemblyman Phil Steck has proposed. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it in a minute or so? Oh, can you hear me, Assemblyman? Uh-oh, I think you're still on mute.
So this is a revitalization, a revision of a very old tax that New York State had from 1905 to 1981. It was very successful and ironically was brought in by a Republican government and ushered out by a Democratic government without going into the history of that. The stock transfer tax is basically 5 cents per $100 sales tax. It's a sales tax on the purchase of stock. It is not a tax on Wall Street. That's a big misnomer. It's a tax on those who buy stock in New York. Most of those people are not from New York, maybe not even from the United States. Like any other sales tax, it's paid by the purchaser. The business simply collects it and remits it to the government. And this is very important because when Wall Street threatens to leave, it makes absolutely no economic sense. They pay billions of dollars trying to leave for a tax, to escape a tax they don't even pay. Now, it's not to say that a stock transfer tax could never be harmful. It's like going to the store. If the government puts a 30% tax on a product, the consumer is not going to buy that product and the merchant's going to be harmed. However, if you put a 5 cent per $100 purchase sales tax, then there really is no potential harm for the merchant, because the history of all these things all over the world is that no one ever is harmed. There's, we can take Hong Kong, which is often trumpeted as the freest market in the world. They have a stock transfer tax that's actually higher than the New York one. And it's been extremely successful, caused no harm. Now, the one thing I would say about the other, one of the very important things is that all these other markets have this tax. So if you're not going to be trading in, you're not going to leave to trade in Hong Kong or London, because they all have the tax. And I think London's really a very good illustration. One of the arguments you will hear from Wall Street is, we have to be competitive against the British, right? So when Margaret Thatcher loosened up all the controls on financial institutions, the United States chimed in and followed suit. One thing to remember, though, and I'll conclude with this comment because more than a minute, one thing to remember, London, the United Kingdom, never gave up its stock transfer tax.
Well, that's a pretty good overview right there. Thank you, Assemblyman.
We get used to doing it.
Well, we're going to dive into the details of that pretty soon. Keep in mind, audience, that this is one of those financial transactions of those three categories that we heard about in the presentation. We also got accrued wealth and personal income. So we're going to pivot now to Senator Robert Jackson, who has his own proposal to increase taxes on personal income. Senator, why don't you tell us your elevator pitch on that one?
Well, thanks, Zach. And let me just thank the CSS for putting out the report. I have a bill that's part of a larger package of 6 bills in which we call the Invest in Our New York Act. And basically what it is, my bill is a personal income tax starting at $300,000 and going all the way up to those making more than $100 million. And people said, $300,000, wait a minute. Well, single filers paying $300,000 or married filers paying $450,000, there will be no really increase. They would pay the same tax of 7.5% for single filers. But if you earn $400,000 as a single filer, you'll go up 0.5%. And what is the cost factor? An increase in taxes that individual would have to pay? $650, okay? In order for New Yorkers to survive this pandemic and to look at doing more. And so it increases. Basically, when you bump up $100,000 to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it's 0.5% more every time you bump up $100,000, to the point where at $900,000, you'll be paying 11% of taxes, and $1 million with 12, and $5 million with 13%, $10 million, 14%. You see, it bumps up further to 1% once you move past $900,000. And so this would bring in anywhere from 12 to 16, 18 billion dollars. And so that's what this tax is about. And instead of saying, okay, we're only going to tax the super rich, no, everyone earning $300,000, really $400,000 or more would have to help the family survive. And so as a family member, we want to, everyone pays their share. And that's what this is about. It's a PIT. This is part of a package of 6 in which community-based organizations and Fiscal Policy Institute and CSS and others are part of it. And so we just want to make sure that when all is said and done, when we do this budget, we have enough billions to take care of all of our needs.
Now, the senator's not the only one looking to have enough billions to keep the state going. Senator Mayer, you also have a proposal, I believe, to raise income taxes. Tell us about it.
Well, thank you, Zach, and thank you, CSS, for having me, and then thank you to my colleagues for being here. You know, my bill comes out of the experience that I think was described earlier in talking about the report. In my district, I could see that those earning 60 or 50,000 a year or less were absolutely devastated by COVID in every way, particularly economic loss. And those that were making, frankly, over millions of dollars in terms of earning were having some difficulties, but the nature of their sacrifice was so much less. And as the chair of the Education Committee, I was very concerned because last year we were forced to use the federal money in the stimulus as a direct offset for any increase in school funding. We fought our best, but at the end of the day, we were simply fortunate to hold harmless. Now the governor has proposed again, basically using all the federal money to supplant the state's obligation. So my bill came out of a desire to have money for education that was focused on those that earn the most. My bill increases the tax rate for the income tax, it's in your first bucket, of those who earn more than $5 million a year, which is a small number in your chart, by 2%. It's a flat tax. So if you made $5 million and $1, you would still pay this higher rate of 10.9 instead of the current rate of 8.9. If you live in the city of New York, or if you live in Yonkers, as I do, there are personal income taxes above that. But that being said, it still is a very competitive rate. And the money would go 85% of it to public schools K through 12 and 15% to SUNY and CUNY, where the state's obligation to fund both primary education and frankly to support higher education has been woefully lacking in the years that I've been around in the legislature. So mine is a very much a school focused, education focused. The one caveat I would give is that President Biden thankfully is very committed to providing additional funding in the third stimulus to schools. And we're going to look and see how much that is. But in the interim, the nature of sacrifice of those at the high end during COVID has been very much out of sync with what the majority of our constituents have suffered. And this was a bill called the SHARE bill to deal with shared sacrifice by those at the top who frankly have not had to sacrifice what those in the middle and below have had to sacrifice. So that is my bill. It's not part of the package of 6 that Senator Jackson described. It's education specific, and that's the basis of it.
Thank you, Senator. And we got one more income tax proposal, this one from Senator May. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. I actually have 2 that I want to talk about. One is Senate Bill 917, which is an ultra millionaires tax. And unlike the ones we've heard about, this one, first of all, it starts at $5 million of income. And then it raises the marginal rate going up from there to a maximum of 10.32%. It's a more moderate bill than some of the other ones, but one of the things I'm proud about with this bill is it has bipartisan co-sponsorship. So it's something that we were able to put out there that actually moved the needle to get Republicans on record saying that they also support raising taxes in this climate. And so I think that's a really important piece of that. The other one I picked up from Jen Metzger, who sadly isn't in the Senate this year, but it's Senate Bill 4528, and that's the stock buyback tax. And this is for, so when corporations are flush with cash, instead of putting that money into, say, hiring more workers or paying their workers more, or maybe, investing in infrastructure, they will just take the money and buy stock back. And that raises the value of the stocks for all their investors and makes the investors happy, often results in windfalls for CEOs. So, and there's no cost to that. There's no recovering any of that, that windfall. So we think there should be. This would be a 0.5% tax on those stock buybacks, and it could yield billions of dollars, estimates as high as $11 or $12 billion a year in revenues for the state.
Thank you, Senator. So remember, everyone, how there was 3 categories of taxes on the table. We got personal income, accrued wealth, financial transactions. Obviously, the income tax is personal income, stock transfer tax, financial transactions. We got 2 outer borough lawmakers who are focusing on the third one, accrued wealth. Very interesting, a little heady. In terms of some of the legal issues involved. Senator Senator Ramos, maybe you could tell us a little bit about this mark-to-market tax that you're pushing for.
Hey, Zach. Yeah, that's right. We here in New York have been suffering under grave income inequality way before the pandemic. And we know that because our hospitals have been chronically underfunded. Heck, here in Queens in the last 20 years, 5 have been closed. Our schools are chronically underfunded. My kid's school is owed $42 million every year. The MTA is in a decrepit state. We've needed money before the pandemic. Now we're in a grave deficit, $16 billion, expected to grow to $60 billion over the next few years. We need to raise some serious cash. And here in New York, there happen to be 120 individuals who are billionaires. More than any other place in the world. I know we think of Abu Dhabi and all of these remote places as you know, rich people's playground, but actually it's right here in New York State that we have the most number of billionaires in the entire world. And together they own more than $600 billion in wealth. $88 billion of that wealth they have accrued over the past year. While we've been suffering, while we've lost loved ones, while we're struggling to keep a roof over our heads, while we're struggling to put food on the table, and that's just not fair. So what I'm proposing is that we tax the unrealized capital gains of billionaires. And we're expecting to raise with this tax approximately $23 billion in its first year, with a recurring effect of about $1 billion. But the idea is that this would include a look back period. And therefore, it's not a matter of just picking up and leaving and thinking that you can run away. No, if you live in our state and you haven't been contributing to to our coffers, our collective coffers here, and here, our workers, and I represent in a district with many working people, have helped you make a profit. Well, then it's your responsibility it's to uphold your end of our social contract here in New York and pay your fair share in taxes. The issue is that billionaires typically hide their wealth in different ways. It's not just that they make a profit and that they keep it all as cash in their bank accounts. No, they keep it as stocks, they keep it in yachts, they keep it in real estate investments, they keep it in many different ways. So this is why we want to make sure that they cannot run, they cannot hide. You are a New Yorker, and it's your responsibility to feel the pain just like the rest of us have throughout this pandemic. And that $23 billion is going to go a long way towards all of the things that I said already, but even the problems that we know now have to be resolved with much more urgency than we've originally given it, like broadband and providing Wi-Fi to all of New York State. We're in desperate need for measures. This is why I'm so supportive, of course, of my bill, but not only of my bill, all of my colleagues' bills. There is a plethora of ideas here for the governor to choose which ones he can put forth. He needs to start thinking about New Yorkers and stop thinking about his donors. And we need him to stand up for working people and tax the rich as soon as possible. It's going to be an interesting, few weeks and I guess months before, the budget is over. And we're going to need every New Yorker on board to help us spread the gospel and help us put pressure on the legislature, on the governor to do the right thing here. Thanks.
Amen.
Hey.
And there's another proposal too to freshman Senator Jabari Brisport is not only has an idea to tax inheritance and gift income, he's even proposing a constitutional amendment to do with this. What's going on, Senator?
Well, first of all, thanks, Zach, for having all of us, and hello to all of my colleagues. Hi, it's me, State Senator Jabari Brisport from Brooklyn, and I want to talk about a bill I have going through the New York State Senate on inherited income. It is bill number S3462. It's part of the Invest in Our New York package, also known as the heirs tax, or I even heard people refer to it as the dynasty tax. And I want to talk about Donald Trump for a hot second, everyone's favorite politician, because you might be familiar with him saying at one point, he was gifted a quote unquote small loan of $1 million. And, he is the poster boy for, someone inheriting a massive amount of money and really not doing an honest day's work in his entire life. This bill is not saying that, everyone who inherits some money is Donald Trump or is a bad person, but it is acknowledging that when you see something like what was in the slides from Ms. Chatterjee earlier, where we have runaway, rampant wealth inequality, a lot of that is driven by individuals who amass more money than they can ever spend in a lifetime, who then die and pass it on to people tax-free who can also not spend that amount of money ever in their lifetime. And meanwhile, our social safety net crumbles. So this attempts to address runaway wealth inequality, and it also attempts to address the racial wealth gap. And I know that was a really, really critical slide that Ms. Chatterjee presented, the incredible disparity in wealth between white families and black families of color. A lot of that is because historically throughout America, for decades, for hundreds of years, black people of color have been locked out of building wealth. So when it comes to being able to pass on wealth to, the next generation, some white people have gotten generations of a head start. So this is an attempt to address the racial wealth gap by, again, taxing inheritances and putting it into the social safety net, social services, and pro-growth things like this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Senator. Halfway through our event, still so much to talk about, but and I want to lean. We got several lawmakers here, but only one president, and that, of course, is Judy Sheridan-Gonzalez of the New York State Nurses Association. Now, if I remember right, this union has been pushing for years to raise taxes on the wealthy, as have some of the legislators here right now. And Judy, I wanted to ask. Earlier I was on the press call with the governor. And he kind of deflected a question about whether if they ended up getting $12 billion from the federal government, whether there would even be a need to raise taxes. I'm hearing, it seems from your union and many elected officials are saying, no matter what happens with the federal stimulus package, the state legislature needs to raise taxes on the wealthy. Tell me about that, how this is not simply about plugging this year's budget deficit. Are you there, Judy?
Unmuting.
There we go.
Thank you so much for putting this program together. It's really important to get this information out there. I think I'm here to put a human face to what all of this really means. When I did look at the New York budget proposals and the cuts to healthcare and the safety nets, regardless of what little bit of money is going to come from the federal government, I kind of thought they were surreal. I felt like it was like pouring salt in a wound. This wound that's festering, that's been festering, that needs treatment, not torment. And a time when we need to generate revenue and support our communities, heal our people, and build creative programs that support health, education, employment, mental health, self-esteem, to staunch hunger, to remedy abject poverty, to provide homes for people facing the imminent loss of homes, reducing violence, both domestic and community, and that list goes on, to give people hope. There are people who can fix this and refuse to do it. And we just find that inexcusable. People got infected with COVID precisely due to the austerity agenda. It contributes, that agenda contributes to all the precursors of illness, what we call the social determinants of health. And the wicked truth is people died directly due to lack of resources and revenue. Nurses know this. We lived it. We stood by helplessly as our patients died because we had a lack of staff, a lack of support, a lack of resources, and clearly a lack of the commitment of our leaders to intervene pre-COVID, peri-COVID, and post-COVID, and we're not out of the woods yet. A definition of austerity is hardship, cutting services, and of course, to those who need the most help, who already face unimaginable challenges. And I just don't understand personally, how can we as a developed society adopt an agenda that is built on a platform of increasing hardship and suffering? Because that's what the austerity agenda is. And we believe we have a moral obligation as leaders. Our people depend on us to solve problems, not create more. So the narrative has to change. The agenda has to change. The commitment to serve as political leaders, union leaders, as community leaders is betrayed when our agenda is crafted to promote suffering, is defined by a commitment to do harm to our people. We as nurses take an oath to do no harm. So our reality is violating that. And I don't know a better way or a kinder way of describing what's happening. Safety net hospitals were already underfunded and under-resourced, were grossly understaffed and overcrowded. COVID didn't create a problem. It only illustrated a problem in its most vicious and vulgar form. So the lack of revenue prevents the formation of a comprehensive public health infrastructure that would have the capability to confront disasters, pandemics, social emergencies. And we saw this in New York City in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. And for example, in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands after Maria and Irma in 2017, and thousands died as a result. We saw it in the spring of 2020 in New York City, and we see it now as the virus continues to proliferate, infect, maim, and kill. We approach 500,000 deaths in our country and nearly 50,000 in our state. We have to ask how many were avoidable, how many could have been prevented, and we'll never know. But think of the families who also don't know. How do they find closure when they think that their loved ones may have died due to the cowardice of a government that refused to change its agenda from one of support to one of hardship? This is very emotional for a lot of us who had to live through this and just feel like never again, not one more death. Sometimes I kind of have to pinch myself to believe it's happening, because are those so protected from harm blind to the tragedy that abounds beyond their manicured lawns or gated communities or country clubs or their mountain villas? Nurses and caregivers, we occupy a front seat to human anguish. And even before we could process the trauma of deaths and illness we experienced 8 months ago, where body bags and shrouds were more numerous than hospital gowns and safe PPE, we face another surge in the virus. Attorney General Tish James shared a report that shocked New York. It was about avoidable deaths in nursing homes in the state, and her investigation tied them directly to understaffing. The report didn't shock us. We've been saying this for years. We only wonder how many deaths does it take to wake up New York to the need for revamping our tax codes, our healthcare system, and our priorities in delivering services to our communities. So we're not here to name one tax proposal versus another. It's clear to us we need state as well as federal relief in big ways. We need changes in tax codes, not just one bill. We support any and all changes that supply revenue in a fair and equitable manner, and in addition, support adequate and trained staff to care for our patients. We support the New York Health Act and the Safe Staffing for Quality Care Act, and assorted legislation that provides revenue to support the revamping of how we deliver healthcare and address all of the social determinants of health. In summary, we believe in equity, not exploitation, salvation, not cynicism, prosperity, not austerity. We're committed to saving lives, not standing by while we watch our people suffer and die. And when we say that defeating the austerity agenda and replacing it with a bold, people-loving agenda is a matter of life and death, it's not rhetoric, we mean it. And we're not going to stand by, we're not going to be silent in the face of this cancer of inequality. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So now comes the time when me and the audience team up to try to pick apart all your proposals. Of course, in the nicest way possible. So reading the CSS report, it seemed that there were 4 main threads of criticism to all these proposals. The governor and people in the business sector have said, well, if you raise taxes on the wealthy will just move. There's also the idea that maybe billionaires will just find ways to work around the taxes, the various evasion techniques. Another, something that it's in defense of that, of the taxes is that, millionaires, some millionaires might leave, but it'll be a small enough loss where the actual tax increases will help the state overall. And another defense that I've seen is, well, if California has done this tax and it's worked, why not New York? Now I want to zero in on the stock transfer tax. Assemblyman Steck brought up a really good point, which is, when the New York Stock Exchange, whose CEO just yesterday was threatening that they would leave New York State if the legislature approves this tax, that they're not even going to pay the taxes to people buying the stocks. But one thing that did come to mind when the Assemblyman was noting, well, London or Hong Kong tax these things is, London is the only major financial center in the UK. Hong Kong is in a special autonomous region. You can't just pick up and go to Beijing so easily. So Assemblyman, what would you say to the idea that, the New York Stock Exchange, for example, has options that stock exchanges in other countries don't have? They could just move to New Jersey or something.
Well, that's absolutely ridiculous, because the cost of moving is in the billions of dollars. And, these people are rational economic actors. They don't act out of spite like my dog. Why would they incur millions of dollars to move to avoid a tax they don't pay? That's the point about the stock exchange. Now, the other argument, which I've been having some discussion offline with the gentleman about, is that they'll just move to an exchange in another state. What other state? What other exchange? There's the Chicago Exchange, which is actually owned by the New York Stock Exchange. And the problem with the concept of another exchange is the reason traders are in New York is its volume. 50% of all the stock traded in the world is traded in New York. If that went down from 50% to 49.9%, it's not going to make any difference. Now, the fact is, New York is not the sole place where stock is traded. It never has been. But what New York gives you access to is the widest variety of stock, the highest volume, economies of scale, and therefore the lowest transaction costs. So if you want to set up a new exchange in Florida, good luck to you, because it's going to be a lot more expensive to trade there. Again, we have to assume that these people aren't acting out of spite and that they're rational economic actors. And by the way, in 1905, when the Republicans adopted the stock transfer tax, all these same arguments were made. In fact, the stock exchange actually incorporated in New Jersey, and some newspaper that I've heard of, even being a woodchuck in upstate New York, I've heard that of this newspaper called the New York Times, and it editorialized against the stock transfer tax. And lo and behold, a few years later, after volume increased and after there was no appreciable negative effects, and there were a lot more exchanges, by the way, within the United States at that time than there are now, the New York Times admitted it was wrong. So this has all been said before, and these arguments simply do not have merit. There are no other exchanges in the United States for these folks to go, and the cost of establishing something new is just absurdly high. Just even if you're one of these computerized algorithmic model traders, which you'd have to pay more under stock transfer tax, the only way you can make money is with extreme volume. So even for those folks, there really isn't that much of an incentive to go anywhere else.
So the stock transfer tax is kind of unique among these proposals because it already exists. It's just rebated at the end of the year.
Well, it's not rebated. Okay, so let's cover this just so everybody's clear. The money never comes into the state coffers. An arrangement was made between the state and Wall Street, whereby there's simply a report by an entity called the DTCC as to how much money the stock would raise. You can't go by their estimate because they're still using the outdated 1905 formulation of the tax, which was modernized in our proposal. But just stands to reason, if the tax raised $14 billion in 2017, and volume on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ and all that is way higher today, how could it raise less money in 2020 or 2021 than it did in 2017? So it's very difficult to predict, but the history of the reports on the tax is, even going by the 1905 formulation, it's still averaging 11 billion a year.
So, but the tax does exist already.
It's on
So it's a relatively
tax
light
law,
lift.
Article 12.
I wanted to,
Article
not a done deal by any means, but I kind of saw it as an opposite, if you will, of what Senator Brisport is proposing, which is to change the actual state constitution. And I wanted to ask you, Senator, you have this proposed.
Thank you for the promotion, by the way.
Huh? I'm sorry?
Thank you for the promotion.
You did a great job.
What you're asking, Senator Brisport.
So Senator Brisport, if I think you're hearing me, I wanted to ask how you reconcile, from what I understand, the state constitution actually prohibits taxes on intangible property. How do you reconcile that with the legislation you're proposing?
I mean, the biggest thing is that, when everyday people like you or I go to the store and buy a soda or, buy a pair of shoes or something, we pay a tax on that. Right? We pay a tax on that tangible property. But when very wealthy stock traders, hedge fund investors, or portfolio managers trade back and forth stocks, bonds, derivatives, they do not pay a tax on that. So this is an attempt to say that if we're trading something for purchasing something, it should be taxed, and that legally there should be no differentiation between, buying a $1,000 purse or $1,000 in stock.
There we go. And another thing that kind of jumped out is we got, Senator May had to leave, so unfortunately we can't ask her about this, but Senator Mayer, Senator Jackson, both of your proposals are fairly similar. They both seek to devote revenues to education, and they also tax high earners. Could you explain a little bit about how the two proposals work together?
I think that what the president of NISNA said, we have a menu, and also Jessica Ramos said this, a menu of suggestions in order to pursue. And we have to determine ourselves and our one house bills and the assembly to hopefully we'll come together and put forward the best plan in order to raise the revenues that we need, not only to deal with this year's budget, but to deal with the pandemic situation and beyond. And because, I'm a fighter for education, that, and everybody knows that. But I said to people, the most important thing, Zach, right now is we need to stop people from being evicted from their apartments or their homes. We need people to have food, and we need people to have health care. People are dying as a result that they don't have health care. People are going psychotic and pushing people on the subway. And so this is beyond this budget. We need billions of dollars. And obviously, I can't blame anyone. And I thank the governor for going to the feds and asking. And we got Chuck Schumer as the majority leader. Hey, listen. So now we have a trifecta. We have a super majority.
I'm trying to find out.
We have a super majority in the state Senate and the Assembly. There's no reason why we cannot bring the governor on board and work with us to make it happen so that everyone will be able to survive. That's what it's about. I'm not saying that my bill is better than her bill. No, they're not going to divide us. We're going to unite. And that's what it is.
I just want to add, Zach, I'm sorry, you're muted. Did you want to say something?
Oh, I just wanted to add to my previous question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Senator.
I just want to second what Senator Jackson said, Senator Ramos, Senator Brisport. One of, I think, the mistakes people have made, particularly about us in the Senate Democratic majority, we may have different views, but we are very committed to the ideas of equity and social justice and achieving it for the whole state. I'm sitting here in Port Chester, New York, a community that has been devastated, just devastated by this pandemic in terms of loss of jobs, so many people who are not eligible for unemployment. The degree of suffering that we are seeing in all of our communities, I also represent affluent communities, and the degree of suffering is quite less. And so we are very committed to finding a just solution that addresses all of our constituents. We are not going to leave people behind because we represent the whole of New York State. So we're going to give a range of ideas, and we have different opinions on them, different ways to get there. But at the end of the day, we can't stand by and see our schools be cut, our hospitals, Judy, out there. These nurses continue to hold the hands of people who are dying, and at the same time don't have PPE in some of our facilities, even here. So, there's a sense of justice that we're united about, even though we may have different approaches and represent different communities. So we'll give a range of ideas, and we have a range of ideas, but we need the governor as a partner. We're very, very fortunate to have Senator Schumer and the House as our partners and President Biden. But we need the governor to be with us on this path, and I'm hopeful he can.
And maybe to use Senator Jackson's metaphor, if it's a menu, you can order any number of entrees, right? So the questions are rolling in from the audience. One of them is actually directed for you, Senator Ramos. Quote, Senator Ramos, on the mark-to-market, how would you handle when the market has a downturn? You would provide a refund on losses that are marked lower?
I wish we could, but in New York, we actually can't do that. We can't provide a refund, although I would say that at the federal level, it makes sense to. And actually, Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon carries the mark-to-market tax bill in the Senate. He happens to chair the Senate Finance Committee. It would make sense to do it at that level, but at the state level, all we can do is provide a credit, meaning that if you lost $1 billion one year, you can get a credit for $1 billion the following year. And this is largely because New York can't print its own money. And so, it's harder for us to be able to provide people with a refund during the recession. We can't deficit finance.
Hey, Zach, you said about a menu so that we can select from. And I like to go to a restaurant and have a menu of stuff. But the menu, when we order food, has to be able to feed everyone and take care of everyone.
We're just, now imagine that the restaurant is so attractive that people would always want to go there. That's a little bit of the defense, to extend the metaphor even more, of raising taxes, broadly speaking, on the wealthy, that, rich people love New York, all their friends are here, the museum boards that they serve on are here. How could they possibly live without New York City? But, COVID-19...
So nice, they named it twice. What can I say? You have the theaters, you have museums, you have people, rich people and people that are well known. All they have to do is put on a hat and everything and walk in the street. And, but if you live in a small place, everybody's going to bother you. Here in New York, it's a huge metropolis, And you can... Central Park and museums and zoos. You're going to have a great time in New York. Come on. I've lived in New York my entire life and I'm not going anywhere.
But COVID-19 has really, changed things a lot. Nobody could have ever imagined that there wouldn't be any traffic in Midtown Manhattan until there wasn't in April or May. So, whether it's facts or just a hunch, I want to open it up to all of our panelists. Why are you so confident that the wealthy will not just pick up and move as many assets as possible down to Florida or somewhere else?
Well, science. I mean, I'll kick it off by saying science. I believe economists when they study and analyze our bills and other proposals and the current state of our economy. And we know that this is not traditionally true. In fact, the New Yorker even covered this issue a few weeks back. The problem with leaving New York is then you won't be a New Yorker. And that's not something a lot of people want to lose. Look, it's true. Who we've lost is actually who we should care about. The fact is that more working families are leaving New York to purchase homes in other states. I have a cousin my age who has a great job. He works for Amtrak, got married a few years ago. Hopefully, they'll have a baby soon. But they weren't able to purchase a home in New York. He and his wife, who's a teacher, decided to purchase a home in Connecticut. Those are the folks who I'm worried about leaving. I'm worried about my undocumented neighbors who, in the middle of the pandemic, decided to go back to, their home countries because they weren't receiving any economic relief here. I want working people to feel protected and for them to know that New York State is going to help them keep a roof over their heads. I don't want them to leave. I will miss them. And billionaires really do have to pay their fair share. It's only fair. We certainly do a great deal to help them create their wealth. The least they can do is uphold their end of the bargain.
Now, if we took what you said and we immediately went downstairs, or at least me, and downstairs to the second floor of the Capitol, I bet, the governor or the security would say something like, hey.
Tell them I sent you.
But, but they would also say, hey, there's just 10, 15 super billionaires who pay a huge proportion of income taxes. If you lose just 3 or 4 of them, that's going to be a big hit for the state. What do you or any of the panelists say in response to that?
We cannot be afraid. We must be able to work so that all New Yorkers survive this pandemic. And just like I have family members, and let me be quite frank, some family members call me up for a loan, and if I can afford to do it, I give it to them because we have to help one another. And that's important. You have to have humanity. You have to have concern for your fellow brother and sisters. And look, Zach, look at New York. For someone to have a New York address, I live on Fort Washington Avenue where the Americans fought the British at, but people are living on Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, it's like, years ago, if you had a 212 area code, man, people would pay you a lot of money for that 212 area code. But New York is a type of place where everyone wants to be, especially when we come back to be the New York that we know. The theaters, the music, the artists. Come on, man, who wouldn't want to be here?
Look, can I just briefly add that, many billionaires and even millionaires concede that they could be paying more in taxes. We've seen Abigail Disney come out, many of the patriotic millionaires, and those are millionaires, never mind the billionaires, right? All of these proposals that we have will allow them to continue being billionaires. They can keep all their houses, all their yachts, all their private jets, everything. The difference here is that thousands of New Yorkers will be able to survive, will be able to continue to exist. I mean, if that's not a moral statement on who we are as New Yorkers, I don't know what is.
I'm also just going to add, historically, in the past, when we have increased taxes on the wealthy, whether it was after 9/11, whether it was after the financial crisis, we have not seen mass capital flight. In fact, the number of millionaires is greater now than it was then when we raised those taxes.
Dr. Torres, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. I wanted to emphasize, I was going to say the same thing that Senator Brisport mentioned, that we haven't seen in the research that raising taxes, whether it's on millionaires, billionaires, or just high earners, has resulted in a migratory response. And I'd add that, people move for different reasons. And there hasn't been any research that has shown that people have left, particularly in response to a tax increase. Millionaires, billionaires, ordinary New Yorkers are socially and economically rooted where they live. And they choose to move for different reasons. Maybe it's climate, maybe it's schools, maybe it's other reasons, but we haven't seen research that shows that people are moving particularly in response to a tax rate increase.
I just would add, Zach, I think there also is a distinction. If we're talking about a single tax, to Senator Brisport's point, or Dr. Torres, there's not a lot of evidence there. If there's a range of revenue changes, I don't think that we have the evidence to know what the impact will be. But the other point that we're not discussing is many other states in the Northeast and in California are considering income tax increases to deal with the impact of COVID on their economy. New Jersey, Connecticut, I think California, we ought not to be in a little vacuum here where we're not realizing that this is a national problem of states that have been particularly hard hit by the economic impact of COVID.
So, hey, Zach, I wanted to say to you that this report here by CSS, there's reports out by many other groups, the Fiscal Policy Institute and grassroots organizations. And this is, so when you get all of these reports, and I don't care who would look at them, the governor's people or the super rich that is hiring an attorney to try to challenge it, basically it just tells you what the needs are. And that's what we're talking about. And our Constitution of the state of New York says, for example, in education, that we must provide our children a minimum standard of education, guaranteed by the New York State Constitution. And also our Constitution, New York State Constitution says, we shall take care of the poor. And so we're just asking our wealthier members of our family to help us collectively do that so that we can grow New York like we want it to be. Our children will be educated, will be involved in the workforce, and that's a good thing. And that's all we're trying to say. Phil, what do you got to say, Phil? You agree?
We hear so much about the rich, the high earners, their feelings, right?
You to comment. Yes, I agree with everything the senator said.
And generally, cynical political reporters like me like to assume that higher taxes are kind of a loser from a political standpoint. Nobody likes higher taxes. But Democrats just won really big in the 2020 elections, right? We got super majorities in the Assembly, the Senate. What does that say about the level of support for higher taxes among working people?
Well, I'd love to comment on this because we just released a response to the so-called SIFMA, which is an industry organization today. And in it, we said that a lot of these arguments are back to the Ronald Reagan, no tax is a good tax. You know, you can't build the shining city on the hill without revenue. It's not going to drop like manna from heaven. So I think the question, one of the reasons I like the stock transfer tax so much, and it's extremely popular in my district, even with Republicans, is because this is a tax that almost nobody really pays to any significant extent. So we can't, the Ronald Reagan philosophy, the neoliberalism, which unfortunately I have to say truthfully, our governor still subscribes to, has been a disaster. Since we unleashed control on the financial industry, and this was in the economic data presented earlier, we went from finance having 10% of all corporate profits in the United States to over 30%. There's a tremendous imbalance in our economic system. And I just want to point out to those, especially from New York City, if you look at the data, the financial industry has not been increasing jobs in New York City as it has become more and more successful. Employment is down 25% in the financial industry. And one of the reasons is there's a lot more computerized trading. 80% of the trading on Wall Street now is done by algorithmic models, which is really a form of gambling. They're not buying stock for investment. And when we did a panel discussion with Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, and he says, we need this to encourage long-term investment. Quite frankly, I don't think it's going to make a hill of beans a difference at the low rate we've set, because we don't want to cause any harm to the market. But certainly we do need to discourage the gambling on Wall Street, which was referred to back in the 1930s, of course, by the great British economist, the greatest economist in the history of the world, John Maynard Keynes. We need to have more of a Keynesian economy. That's what lifted more people out of poverty and into the middle class than any other economic policies in the history of the world.
So we're running low on time, and I want to give everyone a last chance to say something. And it wouldn't be a good city and state event without trying to get you in trouble a little bit. So I was hoping that each of you, in as brief, as hard as it is sometimes for elected officials, and as brief as you can, because we only got just a few minutes, tell me, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And maybe the governor is kind of the horse right now, because, if you go Assemblyman Steck and you say, hey, these are all the great reasons I like a stock transfer tax, he's going to say, I'm not going to do it. But, so you can ask the governor, or you can ask a bunch of other people to help you convince the governor to go along with it. So just in parting, would each of you just tell me very quickly, what is one thing that can be done to help get the governor on board with these ideas, with your various proposals, besides just directly appealing to him, whether it's organizing grassroots activists or anything else? Let's start with Senator Jabari Brisport.
Thank you so much, Zach. I really appreciate it. I mean, it really takes mass grassroots action. That's how we got the incredible housing legislation passed in 2019. If I can plug the Invest in Our New York campaign one more time, it is an amazing coalition of several state senators and state assembly people, and growing at over 150 organizations all across the state. And it really is important that we keep on applying pressure and showing that this is something that is supported by the vast majority of New Yorkers. I think there was actually a poll done in September from a couple labor unions showing that 90% of New Yorkers supported taxes on the rich before cutting any social services. So let's make sure we can deliver on that promise to our communities.
Sounds like a good opportunity for Senator Ramos to jump in here.
Yes, my answer was going to be guerrilla warfare. No, seriously, it's all hands on deck. And this is why so many of us, so many unions even, are out here educating the public about our bills, about the urgency around generating revenue. You know, I think the average New Yorker is hyped up about legalizing marijuana, perhaps online sports betting, some of the cooler revenue generators. But the reality is that, you know, those things will only generate a drop in the bucket. You know, we started enumerating all of the things we need. Add on to that the New York Health Act. We want single payer in New York State. We want all sorts of fixes to elevate the quality of life of all New Yorkers, and that's not going to be free. We don't want to tax working people more. So what is it that is left to do? What's left to do is tax those who have been hoarding money, which is a tangible thing. If we don't have it, if it doesn't exist on our streets, if it's not in the pockets of working people, it's because it's being hoarded elsewhere. How do we get out of an economic pickle? We borrow money, we tax money, right? These are only of the few options that we have. The governor needs to come to his senses, and we need to end dark money in politics once and for all. If this is not the big lesson, then we're wasting our time here. But we can't allow the governor's donors to keep dictating what our economic recovery is going to look like. We've lived under his austerity politics for over a decade now, and that's what has already done us in during this pandemic. We need New Yorkers on board. We need them to call the governor's office, tell them to tax the rich.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Mayer, what are your quick thoughts on what comes next?
One is a group that is never heard from enough, which is public school parents throughout the state. They really must make their voices heard. The problem, the risk is that if we don't address the educational funding shortfall this year, next year we are in a cliff, a dramatic cliff, because he's proposing a permanent shift of money away from schools. We need to hear public school parents from the city of New York and elsewhere. Outside the city of New York, we can't raise property tax to sustain public education anymore. People will not be able to afford to live in the suburbs either. So public school parents, this is your chance. Speak up now. We absolutely need to hear your voices.
And thank you, Senator. And we're running really close on time. Senator Jackson, do you think you can offer some quick thoughts in 30 seconds?
Sure, we just have to follow the Constitution as far as taking care of the poor and educating our children. And we have to understand that we're in this together. We need to communicate with the governor that we cannot reduce the budgets and all of the agencies that he's talking about. He will pull hundreds of thousands of more people into unemployment and poverty, and we cannot go there. So we have to work together in order to get it done. And I'm willing, as a willing partner, to sit with him 24 hours a day to get it done.
And Judy, I want to give you the last word.
Sure. you know, when we talk about the exodus of billionaires, if we reconfigure where our money goes to fix infrastructure, the city and the state becomes more attractive. People will want to come here and live here. Nobody wants to see people suffering and in poverty, see the violence that results, the economic violence that results. You know, when you can fix our potholes and fix our roads and fix our infrastructure and people are gainfully employed, it makes it a much more attractive place to live. And finally, I would say on the second floor, if there's 15 people that make that much money, I think they should be glad we're not talking about legislation that caps income as opposed to just taxing them. I know that's a little snarky, but I'm a nurse and I tell it like it is.
Well, we'll end things with a smile. Thank you so much, Judy. And thank you to all of our panelists for making time for this great discussion, your very busy days. Thank you to our audience. I would like to just throw in a quick plug for some of our upcoming events here at City and State. Tonight, actually, we have our 2021 NYC Power 100 at 5 o'clock. February 11th, the New York's Path to Ranked Choice Voting Bronx Forum at 2 o'clock. And then later in the month, February 18th, is our Diversity Summit in the afternoon. You can find all the information at cityandstateny, like New York.com. I'm Zach Williams, staff reporter at City and State. Hope to catch you next time, and thank you all once again.